Welcome to the third episode of TC2 vs TF2 balance changes. Once again, check out the first two videos if you haven't already, but this is a series talking about the weapon changes made to TF2's Roblox counterpart, TC2, and talking about whether they were deserved or not. Today's mark is going to be a bit of a doozy, so let's take a look at the Pyro, or Arsonist. Before we start taking a look at any of his primary weapons, let's talk about the changes made to his flamethrower in general. Previously, Arsonist was one of the most inconsistent classes because of the way flame particles work. The hitboxes on the flame particles just didn't match up with what was shown, and the hitbox for air blast was ridiculously tiny. After the summer update, the TC2 flamethrower acts pretty much like its TF2 counterpart. The particles are now consistent with what's shown, and air blast has been changed to have a much larger hitbox. The only major difference falls within how air blast works in TC2. While in TF2 air blast deals knockback based on both the player and enemy player's momentum, in TC2 it always deals a set amount of knockback. The air blast hitbox in TF2 is a large cube that covers the Pyro's front side, while in TC2 the air blast hitbox is a large hemisphere that clips through the Arsonist. Additionally, air blasting burning teammates will restore 50 health rather than 20. Anyways, let's move on to the weapons. First on the chopping block is the backrunner, renamed the INTERCEPTOR in TC2. In TF2, the backrunner is pretty simple. You gain crits from behind and gain health when extinguishing burning teammates. In return, your air blast costs 50 ammo instead of the usual 20. The backrunner is generally seen as a pretty balanced weapon that encourages flanking but discourages panic air blasting and support usage, with the only issue being that getting those crits can almost be as inconsistent as random crits. In TC2, the INTERCEPTOR still deals crits from behind and restores health when extinguishing teammates, but replaces the increased air blast cost with a 20% damage penalty. Once again, the INTERCEPTOR is a pretty balanced weapon that encourages flanking, but this time replaces the downside with being a worse all-around weapon. The indicator for what counts as the back is actually 135 degrees, which is pretty generous for a flamethrower, but like in TF2, it's inconsistent. The change wasn't really needed, but it's fine. Secondly is the Phlogistonator, under the same name in TC2. In TF2, the Phlogi is pretty famous, although not for very positive reasons. Let's see why. By dealing 300 fire damage with any weapon, you can taunt, which grants you Uber during its duration, and gain about 8 seconds of crits, or 10 if you can Phlogi cancel. On the downside, you cannot air blast. Not only is this weapon unfun to play with and against, the lack of air blast and encouragement of the WM1 playstyle creates a weapon that's awful when you're losing, mediocre when the teams are balanced, and a pub-stomping beast if you're winning or have a pocket medic. With that inconsistency, I think you can see where the problem is. In TC2, there are a couple changes. Firstly, the Phlogi does not grant Uber during taunting. Additionally, the Phlogi does not deal any afterburn. The final change is that rather than not having air blast at all, the Phlogi's air blast will delete projectiles but cannot knock enemy players around or extinguish teammates. I'd say TC2's version is slightly less inconsistent but still underwhelming. The lack of afterburn still makes it pretty WM1 oriented, and while you do have the option to deal with projectiles now, you still can't really support your team since you're not staying back. You're gonna flank with it or charge head on like a dumbass. Additionally, I want to mention the lack of the Scorch Shot in TC2, which actually removes a consistent way to charge up the Phlogi without risk compared to TF2. It's definitely better than TF2's, but still pretty bad. And rounding off the primaries is the Dragon's Fury, under the same name in TC2. In TF2, the Dragon's Fury shoots limited range 25 damage projectiles at intervals of 0.8 seconds, staying in the air for roughly around the same time. It deals full damage, or 75, against buildings. These projectiles set your enemies on fire for 3 seconds, allowing you to follow up with shots that fire 34% faster and deal 75 damage if you can hit the burning target in the center. Its reserve ammo is changed to 40, and air blasting consumes 5 ammo and takes twice as long to reload. In TC2, the Dragon's Fury acts very similarly with a couple changes. The projectiles, which seem to have a much smaller hitbox, seem to stay in the air for less but travel much faster. Additionally, you have 30 reserve ammo, but air blasting only consumes 3 ammo. These changes aren't much but do force you to play a little closer, so it's fine. I also want to point out that the combo hit animation and sound effect are much less satisfying compared to TF2's. But what makes this weapon so prevalent is what it used to be. The original projectile in TC2 was, guess what, a flame particle, which is not only bugged before the summer update, but also had a tiny ass hitbox, which made this an awful weapon. Another YouTuber, Sam the Man, goes more into depth about it in a video of his, so I'll just link that over in the description. Starting off the secondaries is the flare gun, under the same name in TC2. In both TF2 and TC2, the flare gun is very cut and dry. Outside of reloading passively, it also fires a fast-moving 30 damage projectile that deals 7.5 seconds of afterburn and also crits burning targets. But what makes TC2's flare gun worth mentioning in this video is the projectile. Or rather, the lack of a projectile. Yeah, for some reason the projectile in TC2 is dependent on ping and phases through enemies randomly. Like, I play on a pretty crappy laptop, and the flare gun is quite literally unusable. The flare will show up a full 2 seconds after I fire it, and won't fire where I click on. Not only that, you can't pick up ammo unless the flamethrower has been used. I don't think it's much of the stats fault and instead Roblox's jank, but man, this weapon is awful to use, at least for me. If it works like it's intended to, then it's a balanced combo weapon that gives Pyro some long-ranged afterburn and burst damage, but I still don't get why it's like, you know, dependent on ping. And ending off the secondaries, while that was fast, is the detonator, under the same name in TC2. The detonator in TF2 reloads passively and can be detonated via alt-fire, allowing you to deal some ranged AoE damage. However, it deals minus 25% damage, deals plus 50% damage to yourself when flare jumping, roughly 23 to 44 damage, and only mini-crits burning targets. It's a solid secondary, giving Pyro some much-needed mobility while also allowing you to deal afterburn to crowds of enemies from afar. In TC2, the detonator is pretty similar, but instead of a minus 25% damage penalty, it has a plus 50% damage bonus. And although unlisted, the flare jump will always deal 45 on a jump and 33 on a splash jump. Although TF2's wasn't exactly unbalanced, TC2's version rewards with successful shots with much more damage, which is a really nice change. Additionally, knowing exactly how much damage you'll take from jumps makes escaping a lot less risky. Only issue, flares are still dependent on ping, which means that most of the problems of the flare gun still carry over. In theory, it's a great quality of life change, but too bad I can't experience it. And thus we enter the melees with the stock fire axe, known as the fire extinguisher in TC2. Yeah, another stock weapon that has upsides. In TF2, the main issue the fire axe has is that it's a close range damage source, on the class that deals the most damage at close range. Yeah, see the problem? It's known as one of the worst weapons in the game due to just being a massive redundancy. In TC2, the only change the fire extinguisher has is a debuff removal on teammates that also gives you 20 health. I mean, when there's a Milker or Girardi spammer on the enemy team, maybe? It's still situational and has the same problems as the fire axe, so while this change does make the fire axe better, it's still a very weak buff. Like, it was hard finding footage of this actually coming into play because of how situational it is. Moving on, we have the extinguisher, under the same name in TC2. In TF2, the extinguisher will deal a base 44 damage, but have this damage increase based on the remaining afterburn damage the enemy would have taken. This weapon will also mini-crit burning targets, extinguishing the enemy and granting a 4-second speed boost on kill. On the downside, this weapon has a minus 35% damage penalty, hence the 44 damage, and a 35% slower holster speed penalty. It's a somewhat overlooked weapon due to being a damaging melee on Pyro, but it's still pretty good for what it's worth, although I will mention that you'll usually go in pretty quickly for a combo rather than burn down the enemy for an exposed amount of time, meaning that you'll usually only be hitting hundreds with this rather than the full damage. This means that the speed boost is more prevalent in the finishing potential, which only really comes into play on higher health targets. In TC2, the extinguisher has a minus 25% damage penalty instead, bringing up your base damage to 49. However, that's where the buffs end. On a miss, you will damage yourself and also extinguish all enemies. Additionally, it increases knockback taken by 25% and also deploys and holsters 25% slower instead of just holstering 35% slower. I won't deny that the increased vertical mobility in return for 30% of your health does allow for some easier setup, but man, pulling this out for a combo only to whiff a hit really hurts because of the weird deploy penalty. Like, why is there a deploy penalty on a combo weapon? I don't get it. It's about the same as in TF2 with the additional pro of some vertical mobility at the con of being slightly weirder to use, which is fine since you can get used to it. Now, probably onto the weirdest thing ever. So, the power jack in TF2 grants a 15% movement speed buff while active and grants 25 health on kill, at the con of a 20% damage vulnerability while active. The 25 health on kill always felt really weird on this weapon, but that's actually because this weapon used to provide 75 health on kill and a 25% damage bonus, but Valve eventually redirected it into a utility weapon, and in classic Valve fashion, they forgot to remove the useless stats on the weapon. So in TC2, Rolf decided to split the power jack into two weapons, the Mending Mallet and the Escapist Escape Aid. Let's take a look at both of them and see how they fare with the power jack. The Mending Mallet restores 50% of your base health on kill, which can overheal but fires 20% slower and holsters 50% slower. I mean, I suppose it's fine. I guess it works as a finisher that it keeps you up for future fights or allows you to escape, but I mean, you still gotta pull out your melee as Arsonist and hope your 65 is enough. And melee on Pyro is not very good. It's a mediocre side grade that's worse than the power jack by a pretty big amount, but I mean, that's kind of a high bar to beat, so I guess it's fine. The Escapist's Escape 8 is pretty much the main reason people use the Power Jack, and it's still the meta. It grants a plus 15% movement speed buff while active, and also grants a speed boost on hit. On the downside, it deals 20% less damage and has a 20% damage vulnerability while active. I mean, it's pretty much still the Power Jack, but you deal less damage and get a speed boost on hit. It's the fun parts of the Power Jack and Hot Hand combined, so this is still a great weapon, and the Hot Hand edition is very welcome. And finally, we end our list with the Homewrecker, under the same name in TC2. In TF2, the Homewrecker deals plus 100% damage to buildings, although you're probably not going to be running into engineer buildings with this. Rather, you're going to be using the damage bonus against enemy sappers, because this weapon can destroy sappers with just a single swing. On the downside, this weapon deals 25% less damage towards players. I mean, unless you find cosplaying as an engineer's boyfriend fun, or you see a teleporter at spawn being sapped, then this weapon is pretty useless. I'm actually not a fan of this weapon's design in general, since Spy doesn't need even more screwing over, but that's a video for another day. In TC2, the Homewrecker has the same stats, but now has the upside of piercing damage resistances and also receiving 40% less knockback from damage sources. I mean, I guess you have something against Dead Ringer agents, or you can walk towards minis, take a ton of damage, and one-shot them? I really don't see a reason you'd use this outside of the same reason as in TF2, but now nests are less frequent, so there's even less of a reason to use this. The upsides aren't bad, but the Homewrecker is still just as pointless. Once again, I was struggling to find footage of this because of how situational it was, so a pointless change. Well, that's everything. Arsonist doesn't have very many weapons, does he? I'm really sorry for the long-ass wait, since I've been waiting until Arsonist was fixed until I started the script, because spending 10 minutes explaining what the hell was going on with flame particles would not be very fun. If you have anything you disagree with, let me know in the comments. And I want to take a moment to thank you guys for the support. It really means a lot to me. I didn't really expect any of my content, especially TC2 of all things, to get any views, but man, this surprised the hell out of me, and it really makes my day. Okay, video's done. You can go now. Bye-bye.